Good morning, everyone. I am Taylor Post, Swiftland's Office Manager, and I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Enhance Accessibility, Bridge the Digital Divide for Patrons with Disabilities, and today's presenter, Dr. Stephanie Rollins. Stephanie Rollins is a research and writing specialist at the Air University Press at Maxwell Air Force Base. She is also an adjunct professor for the University of Alabama and teaches digital reference, collection development, and organization of information, among other courses. Stephanie serves on both regional and state library committees, and she has 23 years of experience in academic and special libraries. She holds a BA in English from Auburn University, a master's degree in library service, and a doctorate in public administration, both from the University of Alabama. Please welcome Stephanie. Enjoy her webinar this morning. Stephanie?
Good morning, everybody. Hello, Deb. Hello, Taylor. Thank you again for being here. I'm so excited today to talk to you about accessibility. It's something that is dear to my heart because it's what made me want to become a librarian. When I first started out, I actually interned at the Library of Congress National Library Service, and I thought this is the direction my career was going to go. It didn't end up happening, but I've always carried this concern about accessibility throughout my entire career. And it's something that we need to be mindful of, not just because of the legal implications, but because it's the right thing to do. It provides access to information for everybody at an equitable level. And that's just so important to me and what I do in my life. And hopefully you guys feel the same. And again, what I want to talk to you today about is what are some of the laws? What do we need to keep in mind? How can we do this better? What are some resources that can help people? Those are all things that we're going to talk about. I have a ton of slides. You know me. I try to pack as much as I can into an hour. If we go a little bit over, please feel free to leave. I will put the link at the end of the chat to the PDF for all the slides, and I compressed it so it shouldn't crash your computer or anything like that. So good morning again, everybody. Let me get to the official agenda because I could talk about this forever. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about some terminology. Just like anything else, this area has its jargon. So I want to make sure that we're kind of on board with some of those terms. Talk about what is a disability, because I think some people assume a disability is one thing and it's actually not everything that you think of. It really is a specific set of things that is specified by law, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Why should we focus on accessibility in libraries? You guys know the answer to this question, but we're just going to put it in perspective. If you're new to this, or even if you've been around a while, it's just good to kind of look at the numbers and just think about things. And then what is electronic accessibility? Because that's different from people being able to walk into our buildings or have access to our buildings with a ramp or whatever that might be, right? That's a little bit different. And then what accessibility standards and laws do you need to know for your library? What's the digital divide and how does it affect people with disabilities? We'll talk a little bit about that. And then how can libraries improve this digital experience? And this is where we get into a ton of slides. And if we don't get through everything, again, I want this to serve as a toolkit for you. So the slides will be there with the web links and everything like that. But sometimes you have to make the case for accessibility with your library. We'll talk a little bit about that. How can you implement a plan for accessibility? How can you provide and create accessible content? If you come back mid-August, I think it's August 11th or 13th, I'm actually going to go through a ton of the products and documents that we use and show you how to make them accessible. And it's really not that hard. And with a lot of the things that Microsoft is doing, they've made it so much better in terms of accessibility. But I'll show you that next month. And then how to use tools, apps, and resources to help people with disabilities and their care providers and their family get answers to questions. What resources could you point them to help them? And then I've got some homework opportunities. These are totally optional, but they may be things that you want to do with your staff or just look at and think about. So some terminology, there is a ton. ADA, Americans with Disability Act. Sometimes you'll see the term ARIA, Accessible Rich Internet Applications, Assistive Technology. EIT stands for Electronic and Information Technology. HTML, of course, you guys know is hypertext markup language. And the things that we're looking at today actually affect HTML5. That's what we're looking at and coming up to that standard. And that's the latest version of HTML. The information and communication technology is also something. Sometimes that's intertwined with EIT, which is I'll get to later. Sometimes I'll see the term PWD. That's patrons with disabilities. And we always want to put people first when we talk about terminology with disabilities, just an FYI. And you probably knew that, but I still see stuff with this person is, just has a disability. This person, that's what you want to say, but I'll actually see it the opposite, disabled people. And you always want to put people first. There's some information about Section 504, which is a civil rights law, the Rehabilitation Act. There's 508, which is the federal government web accessibility requirement, and that's affecting a lot of organizations if you have any kind of ties to the federal government. That's something that we're under in my job as, at press and the library at Maxwell Air Force Base. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk a little bit about VPATs. This is one way when you get your products that you can actually ensure that the products that you're buying for your library meet accessibility standards. W3C is the World Wide Web Consortium. I'm sorry, there's somebody outside cutting the grass. Can't help it with teleworking, right? Anyways, the World Wide Web Consortium, we'll talk a little bit about that organization. And then the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And those are so important to providing not just accessible content on the web, but also any other products. Okay, so what is a disability? And you can try to take a guess at this, but really when you're talking about a disability, you need to look at the Social Security Administration and see what they consider to be a disability. So it's basically any impairments in adults ages 18 or over, and it could be temporary or it could be permanent. Sometimes you encounter stages in your life where something happens to you, but it's not a permanent disability, but you would be eligible for disability from the Social Security Service. It also can be for children under the age of 18. And these websites actually list every single disability that's considered under the law. They're usually audio, visual. They can be things like an impairment. So, it's really any physical or mental impairment that limits one of your major life activities. So if you think about any of your senses, that kind of thing. And it's either you have record of such impairment or it's regarded as having an impairment. So again, things like hearing, mobility, and visual impairments, even chronic alcoholism and depression, AIDS-related complex. And I'm guessing too, I haven't looked recently, but I'm guessing that they would add the coronavirus as well. So basically it's anything that you would think would affect a major life activity, like walking around, talking, hearing, seeing, breathing, learning. And they've also looked at adding with some of the 508 regulations and things, also language and problems, performing manual tasks, and also caring for oneself. So why should we focus on this disability? Talk a little bit about what the American Library Association puts out. So they are making sure that people with disabilities, who are a large part of our community, and a lot of times they're severely underrepresented in the library profession. And so libraries can play, of course, a catalytic role in the lives of people with disabilities by facilitating their full participation in society. And that's our ultimate goal, to enable people to use our libraries just like anybody else. And so the ALA has a services for people with disability policy. It came out in 2001. It hasn't really changed that much. Some of the things they look at is the scope of the disability law. So they talk about Section 504, 508, the Americans with Disability Act. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. And it also talks about library services, that you can't discriminate against individuals with disabilities, and making sure that individuals with disabilities have access to services such as extended loan periods, late fines, reserve periods, different things like that. Also, the facilities are under the Alabama Library Association's policy that you don't have architectural barriers. Your collections also need to be accessible to people with disabilities. You need to have well-planned assistive technology, employment. Make sure you recruit people with disabilities. And any kind of training you have for librarians or staff needs to also have the ability to have accessibility, like we have Deb here today. And you'll have a recording of this, which will have a transcript, things like that. So those are some of the things that ALA sets out, and you can take a look at this. There's a lot more there, but it's just very thorough and kind of talks you through it. So why focus on this? Oh, oops, sorry. Okay, so the numbers. When I look at things, I try to put it in perspective, and one of the best ways to do that is to look at statistics. Give or take, they're not always, thinking about coronavirus recently, it's really hard sometimes to understand the statistics, but this is done by the American Community Survey, and so it's something that's pretty easy to look at, and you can run it for your state. I'll show you later some things you can do for your actual county. But in 2018, 12.6% of persons for all ages, and I've actually seen so many different statistics and it's actually higher. So this kind of breaks it down by age, and then you can see the different disability types. So you can see that visual, hearing, ambulatory, cognitive, self-care. So you can see, ambulatory disability is one of the highest. Independent living disability, those are some of the things to think about. And also, if you look at the age, majority is 65 and over. So you can see kind of the age breakdown for that. And I also wanted to look at Florida. So United States is 12.6%. And this is, again, just another way of looking at it. If you're more of a graphic, visual person, then this is another way that you can look at the data. So for Florida, I was just curious, and so I wanted to give you the data on that. So you can see that Florida actually has a higher number than the national average. And you can see for Florida that some of the same statistics track that 65 and over. For Florida, again, it's higher ambulatory disability. And the reason I share this with you is when you're thinking about your services, access to your library, collections, online, and how people access things, you can kind of see, well, where do we need to possibly spend our time? And so if they have ambulatory disability and they can't get in your library, that's definitely something to consider, right? So again, here's just another visual way to look at the numbers. And so the other thing that's kind of scary, and we know this with all the kind of crazy information that's out there about coronavirus, is that people are online. This is an older study from the Pew. They've updated it kind of a little bit from time to time, but really the same statistics track. And I think the statistics are probably even higher. But people are online. They're looking for information about disabilities, about health, about them or their caregiver. And so we need to focus on our collections having this accessible information, on us being trained on what's out there with resources. And so it finds the survey that 74% of adults who use the internet, 80% have looked online on any different topics. And so someone has read a website, a group, or a blog, and I'm sure now with Corona it's even higher. Also, that 74% of the adults who use the internet have watched an online video, online reviews. They have gone online to find other people they can talk to. So there's just some interesting statistics about people are online, and they're out there and they need information. And so how are we providing that information, and is it accessible? Some other terms to think about, there's this accessibility versus universal design. So accessibility is a design principle, not an added feature or afterthought. So when you're designing things, you don't want to have to go back and do it. You want to design things with accessibility in mind. And so if you look at this picture, I'll talk about universal design in a second, you'll see that there's stairs, but there's also a ramp. It may be a little bit difficult to see. So you can see that this was designed in the beginning with access for everyone, not just stairs and they went back and then they had to put a ramp in kind of thing. So that's universal design. It works for anyone. And so I love this quote. We can reframe accessibility in terms of what we provide, not what other people lack. And this is a great article here by Ann Gibson. So how can we provide accessible library services? Really, some of the things you can do is know your community. And there's ways that you can get statistics from the census. Again, that American Community Survey that I showed you. And so knowing your community and knowing who your patrons are, what kind of information are they seeking? And then having that knowledge of disability resources for caregivers, for your patrons, and also knowing if your resources are accessible. Again, you got that VPAT, that document that helps you make sure you purchase library resources that meet basic disability, that meet basic accessibility. I'm sorry, somebody's, can you hear me okay? No? Okay, I'm just checking. There is someone in the front yard cutting the grass or something, so I apologize. Maybe it's, okay, going in and out. Got it. Let me get closer to my mic. That may be helpful. Okay, so again, making sure you evaluate your resources that you purchase, making sure that you communicate, market what you have to your patrons, and also, doing instruction on disability resources, making sure you include people in your people with disabilities in your friends groups, and so that they have input into your resources as well. Of course, technology is huge. We're going to spend a lot of time on that today. And then considering the ethical and legal issues. We're not doctors, we're not lawyers, and a lot of people with disabilities need help with those types of queries, or their caregivers do. So knowing where to refer people is a big deal. This is the census data, and you can run statistics. You can see, what are the common disabilities in your area, and that'll help also feed into what you need to do for your collections. So what is electronic accessibility? I'm pretty sure you guys know, but it's basically making sure that when you're on the web that you're inclusive of all people with disabilities. And so again, web accessibility is people with disabilities can use the web, and it means that they can perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with the web, and that they can also contribute. It encompasses all disabilities, including visual, auditory, physical, speech, cognitive, and neurological disabilities. And it's so important. We know this because it provides equal access and equal opportunity to people with diverse abilities. And there's also a strong business case for accessibility. If you look at the numbers, I didn't really go there with that because libraries are a business, but we don't really make money, so it's kind of hard to understand the return on investment, but it really enriches people's lives to be able to have equal access to information. And I don't know how you put a number on that, but you can build a strong business case for accessibility. And it also just kind of lines up with best practices such as mobile web design, being able to be independent on your device, different things like that. And there's different ways you can build an accessible website, and in fact now it's kind of, especially for federal organizations and offices, it's the law, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And so WCAG 2.0, and it's actually updated now to 2.1. So there are some standards there, but the law talks about WCAG 2.0, and I'll come back to that. But basically, the 4 principles of web accessibility are perceivable, and that means that people can, the web content or computer content now is available to the senses, such as sight, hearing, and or touch. When you talk about operable, it's just kind of what it says. It means that you can use the interface, the forms, the controls, the navigation, you can operate it. When you talk about input modalities, when you're talking about input, you're kind of making it easier for people to operate. And when you're talking about, sorry, looking at my notes, there's a lot of information on that. When you talk about understandable, it means the information and the operation of the user interface must be understandable, so you can actually understand what you're supposed to do. And then the last one, when you talk about robust, it means content can be used reliably by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technology. So it means that it's robust enough, your site or your document or your PDF is robust enough that it can be used by a screen reader or a braille reader, different things like that. So again, these are the four things put out by the World Wide Web Accessibility Initiative. And so again, just things to keep in mind, and also things to put on your checklist. And I'm going to go through this in a little bit more detail, like what kind of things do you have to do? What does this mean? So we'll go through a little bit of that. Not in extreme detail because there are like 50 bazillion things that you need to check, and I've got a link for that. So the power of the web, I love this quote, is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. And this is by Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the web. And so he, again, didn't put accessibility as an afterthought. He put it as one of his design principles in designing the web. You know, the HTML, the coding, different things like that. However, you know, it's what you do with it that makes it accessible or not, right? So what not to do? There's some websites out there, and you can take a look at this one, and there's also one that has bottles. Is this crazy or what? Does this just hurt your eyes? Even, you know, can you imagine somebody who can't see and how overwhelming the screen reader would be? And also next month we'll talk about how to use a screen reader, and I'm going to take you through what it sounds like when something's accessible and when something's not. Okay, so this is from the University of, I believe, Pennsylvania. But this is just kind of what an accessible web page should look like. And it just kind of gives you some information about tables and headings. And again, next month we'll go into this in great detail. You could spend an hour just on this. Yes, exactly, Patricia. That bridal website is not accessible to anyone. Exactly. And even people that can see, you know, and hear and different things like that, there's still websites that are inaccessible, right? So can you imagine how it is for somebody who can't hear or can't see or has issues with movement, different things like that. So again, you could come back and look at this. So what are the guidelines? So again, the guidelines are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And there's 3 levels of conformance. There's A, double A, and triple A, kind of like baseball teams, right? So this is a link to a quick reference. And what you need to know, and again, I'll talk a little bit more in detail about what's on the checklist, is that judges find highly persuasive the number of cases adopting WCAG 2-point success level, AA, as the appropriate standard to measure accessibility. So when judges are looking at court cases brought forward because of inaccessibility of the web or inaccessible documents, different things like that, this is what they look at. And I promise I'm going to talk about what does that mean in just a minute. So in January 2018, they did a refresh on the 508 guidelines and that whole federal websites to standards. And again, it's not just federal websites, it's also most documents produced by federal organizations. So if it's a PowerPoint, if it's a Word document, so it's also computers, making sure your computer is accessible, different things like that. So it's more than just what people usually think was, oh, is your website accessible? It's more than that. And so again, these are guidelines that provide the basis for online accessibility and computers and different things like I just said. So what's the role of the library? You guys tell me, what do we do in terms of accessibility? So, I mean, what are some of the products, I guess is what I'm asking. So, of course, we have the library homepage we need to think about. We've got research guides. We've got handouts and tutorials, right? Videos, different things like that. We have our databases. We have our electronic books. We have electronic journals, videos. We provide computer access. What else? What else can you guys think of that we do, that we provide? You can type in the chat box and I'll keep going. Programs, exactly. So you may need to have somebody like Deb come. You may need to have something recorded that automatically does transcripts, so you can post it later on your Facebook or whatever. Different things like that. And of course, we also do social media, right? A lot of the stuff that I've read recently talks about how you also need to make your social media accessible. And I was just looking yesterday, I'm also doing a presentation on this for my organization later today, as a matter of fact, on Section 508, because we are a federal organization. And I just went and looked at the Air Force homepage on Twitter, and they don't have any alt text for their pictures. Um, oh, that's fantastic. Robert says we have Echo Dots on our public service desk for translation between languages and for customer access and socially distanced. That's fantastic. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the law and why it matters. Of course, we want to have equitable access, but we also, want to protect our libraries and we want to protect our patrons. And so the law is kind of important in talking about accessibility. We want to provide equal access and equal opportunity. We want people to have academic freedom. And technology is kind of our academic medium, right? That's the way that people with disabilities or anybody can gain access to information. And so it's important also because of the laws and policies that are out there. We want to do the right thing. So there's some laws out there to be aware of. I'm not going to go into extreme detail. However, of course, there's the Americans with Disability Act, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which talks about Section 504 and Section 508. And then there's also Section 255 of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And then there's the WCAG. The WCAG is not a law, it's just recommendations. And we kind of talked about that a little bit. That's the POUR acronym: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So what about ADA? Of course, we know this, being a library, we know what ADA is. But again, it's just a law that prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in everyday activities. It's got some regulations with employment, with access to state and local government, and public accommodations and commercial facilities. And if you'd like to, you can take a look at that. Of course, libraries fall into all three of those sometimes. Section 504, again, it protects qualified individuals from discrimination based on their disability. And it also protects people with disabilities from being excluded to receive programs and benefits and services. And so sometimes there's things about libraries under that. Again, it's divided into these different parts, and you can kind of go take a look at that if you'd like. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I can find information for you on this. So if you have legal questions about ADA, 508, 504, different things like that, please talk to somebody who is an expert on this. So probably most important and the most recent update is to Section 508. And this is the federal government's electronic information and technology accessibility requirement. That's a mouthful. But basically, in 1998 and then also in 2018, Congress amended the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 to make federal agencies make their electronic and information technology accessible to people with disabilities. And here's the formal code law, hopefully I got that right, that applies to all federal agencies when they develop, procure, maintain, or use electronic and information technology. And that's just about everything we use today, right? And so again, you have to give disabled, I got this wrong, I need to fix this, employees with disabilities, right, people first, and members of the public access to information comparable to the access available to others. Again, the U.S. Access Board is somebody you want to check out. They're responsible for developing the information and communication technology accessibility standards. Again, on January 18, the Access Board, they issued a final rule that updated accessibility requirements covered by Section 508, and then they refreshed the guidelines for telecommunication equipment, which was subject to Section 255. Excuse me just a second, sorry. If you have a second, type in the chat if you've had any similar crazy work from home experiences that are mortifying, like somebody cutting your grass. Oh my goodness, right? Right, Patricia? Power washing the house before painting it. Oh my goodness. I thought dogs were going to be my downfall. I have 3 dogs, but they've been quiet. Anyways, okay, so hopefully you can hear me a little bit better now. I'll keep trying to talk louder. Okay, so again, this went into effect January 18th, 2018. And so what it does is it was in a response to market trends and innovations because the last update had been so long ago. We had Facebook and YouTube and all these different things, and so they wanted to refresh it so that people with disabilities would have equal access and make sure that this was established in the federal government. And so basically what happened was, what the takeaway from this is that with 508, they want you to be in alignment with the WCAG 2.0. And so I'm just going to talk you through this. Hopefully this won't take too long. And there's a link here. So if you wanted to look at it, you could see what this means. But if I just tell you perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, that doesn't really give you a lot of information about what you need to think about when you purchase resources, when you put things up on the web, when you make a PowerPoint or a Word document or a PDF. So some of the things you need to think about with perceivable, one of the guidelines is to make sure that you provide text alternatives for any non-text content. That's something we all know. And like I said, next month I'm going to show you how to walk through just about everything to create alt text in your social media. Also, you want to make sure that you provide alternatives for time-based media. So for instance, if an audio or video is designated as an alternative to web content, like audio or sign language, then the web content itself serves as an alternative. So again, like if you have a transcript or a video that has content that's provided for non-live video only, things like that. So you want to make sure, like you have your captions pre-recorded, if at all possible, different things like that. Also, you want to make sure that you are adaptable. And so what that means is that you can generate content that can be presented in different ways. And what's big now is making sure that things are mobile and you don't lose content when you pull the website up on mobile. Like a lot of people with disabilities are way more savvy with their smartphone and can do a million things if it's in a mobile environment. Well, if you didn't also have a mobile version of your website, they could lose information or the structure of the website. So that's something that's important. We also talk about distinguishable. What does that mean? Well, that means it's easier for users to see and hear content, including things like separating the foreground from the background, different things like that. Also, things to think about are, and again, there's like 20 different things under each one of these, so I encourage you to go take a look. And again, they have different levels. They have A, AA, triple A is the best, but once you start looking at triple A, it's basically a lot of text-only type things for your website, which makes it really hard to make it accessible for everyone. Also, if you look at Principle 2 under Operable, you want to make sure it's keyboard accessible. That means that it can do everything from a keyboard. That means like tabbing from each link, different things like that. It means that you can use keyboard shortcuts and different things like that too. When we talk about enough time, you need to have users be able to have enough time to read and use content. That's one of the things on Instagram or Facebook when we look at those stories. I'm like, wait, I didn't get everything. So again, making sure to provide users enough time to read and use content. Also, you want to make sure not to design content that is in a way that's known to cause seizures or physical reactions. Has anybody ever seen an example of this? I used to have one, but you want to make sure there's no flashes that's more than 3 times per second. And again, if there's a way to disable movement on the website, that's a great thing to have. Again, that's a AAA level. Also, you want to make sure it's navigable. So there's ways to help users navigate, find content, and determine where they are. So you don't want to have 20 different navigational things, and that's probably one thing I need to look at with our website. It's always consistent. Or there's a way to skip navigation to get to just what you want. Input modalities, what that means is that you make it easier for users to operate functionality through various inputs beyond the keyboard. So if things like pinching, swiping, or dragging are not essential, then that can be performed with a single point, different things like that. So again, or if it's a clickable target, it's big. So think about people who have trouble with movement and using their fingers and different things like that. Okay, so principle 3, if you look at understandable, that means that, again, information in the operation of user interface must be understandable. So the first one is readable. And it's, yes, that's what you see on the screen, but it's also that the text content is readable and understandable. So again, it's in HTML and it has identifiable attributes like a header or different things like that. Again, if there's any jargon or unusual words, different things like that. It's also predictable. So, it's going to appear and operate in predictable ways. And also, there's input assistance. So if somebody needs help, there's ways to help users avoid and correct mistakes. So if it's a form, and and I still do this as a sighted person, that you put something in and you're like, what's going on? Why won't it take? And, it does this tiny message off to the side. That's a design flaw. But you need to make sure that you have a way for people with disabilities to know and get help for things like forms and different things like that. So again, they can avoid mistakes. And then it has to be compatible. So you want to make sure that you maximize compatibility with current and future user agents, including assistive technology. So again, what that means is that it's compatible with things like a screen reader or a braille refresher, different things like that. So I asked about seizures, and Reva says that she gets migraines from PowerPoints with splashes and dramatic entrances of slides. Good to know, Reva. I'll try to make sure I don't do too much of that. I don't do a lot of movement. And then Sharon says that we had it happen at one of the story times where the lights in the play caused a patron to have an issue. Oh no! Wow, that's difficult and something you wouldn't necessarily think about, right? But again, I think people have gotten away from a lot of the flashing things that we had kind of back in the late 90s, right? There's not a lot of flashy stuff anymore. Mostly people focus on videos. And I think videos too can cause seizures depending. Gotcha. Oh, the breaking glass one. I don't even think I know about that one. Maybe that's a good thing, Reva. So Section 508 is also kind of a roadmap for making electronic and information technology accessible. It's talking about not just the things you do to make your content accessible, but also building awareness and support, practicing universal design, making sure you update your agency policies, and again, like we talked about already, make sure you procure and develop accessible technology, create accessible documents, which again I'm going to go into great detail next month, and then you want to make sure you measure and monitor your progress. There's a ton of information at the Section 508 website about how to do all this. So one of the big things that's happening now is that with the changes in a lot of the laws, and then just access to information period, is that there have been some record-breaking lawsuits. You can see kind of the trend. And so with the changes in legislation, it's providing people with opportunities to demand, equal access to information. And so you can kind of see the trend here. Of course, libraries have been sued. I haven't really been able to find a lot of recent cases, but just know that academic libraries, public libraries definitely can be sued over issues. Sacramento Public Library, this is kind of an older one, but they bought, I believe it was Nooks, but they didn't provide any accessible software for the Nooks. So good thinking, because they're trying to provide their patrons with a new device and new service, but apparently didn't think it all the way through. And of course, academic libraries sometimes don't always walk through everything, and so there have been some court cases at Berkeley, the University of Montana, Penn State. If you have something else, how can they ensure they're completely covered against lawsuits? Again, making your content accessible, looking at these WCAG rules, and making sure that if you do a PowerPoint, that it's accessible, and there's ways that you can check that. If it's a video, do you have a transcript? Does your disability services office on campus provide help with that. So making sure that people with disabilities are aware of those services. Now that's in an academic setting. For public libraries, again, going through that checklist, when you buy services, doing your best effort to look at the VPAT, demand a VPAT that lists all these different things. Those are your best efforts that you can do. Sharon's still typing, so I'll come back to you. So you guys can come back and look at this, but these are some of the lawsuits that have happened recently. Five Guys, Winn-Dixie, Domino's Pizza, Nike. Yes, absolutely, Sharon. Utilizing all your resources to double and triple check your programs, and not just your programs, but basically any content that you put out. And also, like Patricia says, providing assistive technology. So some of the other lawsuits, Netflix, Target, the Sydney Olympic Games, American Express. And then type in the chat box. I'm just curious. I want to know. And again, this is all just to get you thinking. There's no judgment here. But what does accessibility look like at your library? Is it in writing? What's the responsibility of say, your administration, the librarians themselves? If you're an academic library, the faculty, staff, teachers. What's the student's responsibility? Just kind of a quick statement on what does it look like at your library? And I'll keep talking and come back to the chat box. But I just want to know, do you have it in writing? Do you have something? Do you know exactly what it says? And that's very important. Again, if you want to make sure that you're covered against lawsuits, is knowing what your library's statement is. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the digital divide, and I think you can kind of guess what this is, but I just want to spell it out for you. Again, it's that gap between populations that have access to modern information and communication technologies and those that have restricted access or none at all. So very simple definition. A lot of times you think about developing countries with this, but it also refers to people with disabilities. And if you look at some of the statistics, how are people with disabilities affected by the digital divide? I love this graphic. It shows that I don't really love this graphic in the fact that it points out the divide, but that it points out some facts that I think we need to be aware of is that, 54% of households with a disability use the internet in the USA, and households with no disability, 81% people use the internet. So again, there's that gap there. Again, 15% of the world's population that lives with a disability, 2 to 4% experience significant difficulties in completing daily activities. That's hard. That's hard for people with a disability, for people that are caregivers, for families. Again, people with disabilities have a cell phone, 74%. 54% of them use the internet, and 47% of them have a desktop computer. And so, in low-income and middle-income countries, 5 to 15% of people who require assistive devices and technologies have access to them. 5 to 15%. So that's just something to be aware of. So libraries can definitely help fill in that gap, fill in that digital divide. And so sometimes in your library, I would hope not, but a lot of times you need to stress the importance of accessibility. Again, you can use my PowerPoint. Please feel free to use it. Sometimes you're going to have to provide case studies and statistics like this lawsuit, like some of the statistics I'm going to show you later very quickly. And again, make a quick list summary of the benefits that come with accessible websites and documents, your software, your mobile applications, your assistive technology. Provide facts on how this ties in with your search engine optimization that brings people to your library website, to your products. Again, we're not a business, but there is a website where you can kind of run a return on investment beyond my skill set right now, but it's a free website, and you can kind of talk about things with libraries and how to get a return on your investment if you focus on disability. And again, legal issues, provide some of the court cases. It's the right thing to do, it's the legal thing to do. So just some things to how you might make the case for accessibility. You may also need to implement an accessible e-resource policy. Sharon says there's little in the employee manual and the IT resources, but it's part of the training of the staff. Well, that's great that your staff is being trained. And you said also people have computer device training with our branch manager geared to disabled patrons. Okay, fantastic. So how can you get there and have an accessible e-resource policy or information? There's some things you can do. You can do a needs assessment. And this may be something that your libraries need to do. A needs assessment, a self-assessment, you need to get buy-in. Of course, you need to move to implementation, and then you need to sustain it. So what does that mean? So needs assessment, we talked about in the beginning. Who are your patrons? Who are your people with disability? What resources are available to them? Again, you said that, Sharon says that their branch manager sounds like a great resource. Again, so what resources are available? Again, are there any current accessibility efforts underway? These are questions to ask. Have you tested your website? I hope to be able to show that to you today. We may not. If not, next month I'll definitely show that to you. Do you have accessibility policies in place? Are they in your collection development? Are they spelled out? Do you know if your databases are accessible? Did you get a VPAT that details every single thing that the vendor will do to provide accessibility? And they're out there. I'm going to show you that in a couple minutes. Identify, get buy-in from key players, the library, the school, the university, or the administration. And then draft your argument, kind of like we talked about. Make the case. Legal, ethical, return on investment. And then task force. It sounds like Sharon has people in place at her library that are kind of an informal task force. Set standards, goals, and a timeline. What do you want to accomplish? How frequently should you update? And then who needs training? How will it be provided? How will you ensure quality control? Again, there's not answers here. There's just a lot of questions, right? So will you have policies? Again, how are you going to maintain this? Job descriptions, will you put it in writing? Different things like that. So that's a homework activity for you if you're interested. So who benefits from digital accessible design? Anybody with a disability, right? And even people without disabilities. It benefits everyone. And I'll come back to your comment, Marcia. Sorry, let me keep going. So how can you provide accessible e-resources? Again, think about your library's collection development policy. Does it reference accessibility? Does it mention web accessibility or web accessible resources? This is very important. And ask yourself what you can do locally and engage your library leadership. Make sure you modify your collection development policy to reflect this. And again, that's another way that you can protect yourself from lawsuits, is to have it in writing what you're going to do to provide accessible content. So here's an example. I have both academic library examples. If you have a public library example, please send it to me. But it just talks about what you're going to do. And then another example is, this is from a public library. And so you can see it talks about their collections. It talks about access to information. There are more examples out there. And then a VPAT. And so a lot of vendors supply navigation aids. A lot of the big vendors. This is just a couple of examples. This is vendor supplied navigation aids. And you need to stress to vendors when you enter into the licensing and negotiating part of your contract that accessibility is very important. You want to make sure that all these different things happen. Again, request a voluntary product accessibility template. So these are ways to get help with licensing, to make sure you get a VPAT. Some ways you can look at that. There's also some helpful reports that you can look at. And then a VPAT, like I said, it's a standard for vendors to use to document how a given product provides accessibility support for people with disabilities. And it was designed by the Information Technology Industry Council. So some of the pros, a lot of them are standardized. They meet Section 508 guidelines. Cons, sometimes when you're looking at these VPATs, it requires a high level of expertise. I mean, I told you there's an entire checklist on WCAG too. And so you kind of have to know what you're doing. So it requires a little bit of research. This is kind of an example of one. This is from LexisNexis. I just want to give you some sites for homework. These are ways to get some VPATs so you can kind of see what different vendors do. If you want to look at two of them just to kind of get a flair for what a VPAT should be or what it's actually missing. Do they identify similar problems? Do they display similar levels of expertise? Different things like that. So in terms of creating accessible content, again, I'm going to go in much more detail next month. But our library homepage, our LibGuides, our research guides, handouts and tutorials, databases, ebooks, e-journals, videos, digital reference. There's so many things that we need to make sure that creating accessible content becomes part of the process when we're creating, and like we talked about earlier, not an afterthought. So for your library website, questions to ask is, can patrons get information they need? Do you have good color contrast for people, for instance, who are colorblind? Is there also keyboard-only navigation, alternate text for images? Is it easy to read and in plain language? You have clearly defined headings. You have captions and transcripts for videos. Again, you're going to minimize people who might have a seizure with carousels, minimize carousels and other animations. So here's some also things. A lot of universities and academic libraries use content management systems or WordPress. So here's some recommendations and some tips on how to make content accessible for those services. For virtual reference, I think that can be a cherry on the top for libraries because it takes out that intimidation factor of coming up to the reference desk. And right now when we're social distancing, I don't know about you guys, but I think virtual reference is one of the best things ever for our time right now. Again, there's some learning curves with doing virtual reference effectively, but again, it's kind of a way to help people with digital reference and getting access to information. Also, journals, ebooks, and audiobooks, different services, they have content accessibility built in. Again, there's different fonts and things you can do with Kindle. These are the top 3 screen readers. Next month, I'm going to take you through NVDA, which is a free screen reader. Of course, we know about Apple VoiceOver, and then also JAWS. JAWS is a paid software, but we'll talk more about those next month. So for homework, what I wanted you guys to do is take one of those, maybe the free screen reader or this Chrome box, and actually take it and try to listen to your web page and see what happens. So some accessible content basics. So some of the things you need to think about are when you do a alt text is you don't want to make it the name of the file or a long website. You want to make sure that you describe it correctly, and it doesn't have to be a paragraph, and you don't want to describe anything that a visual person doesn't already see. So those are some of the things to do with looking at images. Also, make sure that when you do a link, that it doesn't just say click here or it's a long website. You want to make sure that it says something like tutorials. Multimedia, again, sometimes the auto captioning has gotten so much better. YouTube is actually pretty good. But sometimes they still get it wrong. So you want to make sure and check that when you do your multimedia. Again, adjustable size and contrast. This hopefully, Reba, this image on the left doesn't give you a headache. But again, making sure that people can read it and the screen reader can read it as well. Again, accessible navigation, making sure you have a logical order and sequence. We talked a little bit about that with some of the guidelines. And with forms, make sure you label the form field because the screen reader and somebody who's blind is trying to read your site and fill out a form. And you want to make sure that the form doesn't time out on them. I've had that happen to me. It's very frustrating, right, to have to go back and get in there. Actually, Natalia, there are a lot of places, and I think I've got some sites here about checking color, and it will check it for you and check your website automated. These are some sites to check your website here, and they're all free. Again, here's one on contrast and color, so thank you for asking. Again, check for color blindness, check for contrast, and so that's something, again, to think about with your website, so thanks for mentioning that. Some free tools, you can check tabbing to see if your website does actually go to the right spots. You just hit the tab key in Chrome and Internet Explorer. Again, you can check your HTML in the Wave. There's actually a Google Chrome Accessibility Developer tool. I have it actually installed in my browser. Cynthia Says is a great place. It's free. This website here is a really good illustration of before and after accessibility. You can kind of take a look at that. So for homework, take one of these sites that's free and test your website. I'd hope to show that to you today, but we're kind of running close to time, and I just want to get to some of the resources that might help your patrons with disabilities, or you answer a question for a caregiver. Okay, so accessible documents in multimedia, we already kind of talked about this. You want to make sure you have good heading structure, alternate text, make sure you have meaningful hyperlinks. Tables, that you could do a whole session on tables, but you want to make sure that your rows, you have them coded right, so when a screen reader picks it up that you know where you are in the table. You want to make sure when you export your Word documents to PDF, you don't want to print, you want to save as PDF. Because when you print to PDF, it loses any structure that Word had, and then you have to fix it. And then you want to check accessibility features. Like I said, there's a lot of built-in things now that will help you. There's a mixture that people advise, making sure that you can do some of these automated checks, but there's still a lot of manual checks that you have to do. The automated doesn't catch everything, always. So here's a list of things you can do, checklists that you can look at to check things manually. Adobe, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, your HTML, and your multimedia. So if you wanted to make sure your Word file was accessible, I'm going to go through this really quickly. This is for 2016 Word. The Office 365 is a little bit different. They have some improvements. But basically, you click on Info and you click on Check Accessibility. And this accessibility checklist here tells me things that are wrong with my document. And you can click on them and you can actually fix them. So another homework activity, pull open a Word document and check it for accessibility. PDFs, when you go, again, this is the older version kind of Word, when you go to save something as a PDF, you want to click on Options, and then over here you can see highlighted, click on Document Structure Tags for Accessibility. Because the worst thing is to be in a PDF and try to go back and try to fix all your tags. Okay. So, take a Microsoft Word document and try to convert it into a PDF. Remember, click on Save, not Print. Again, if you have the full Adobe Acrobat, full Adobe Acrobat DC, where you can actually edit PDFs. There you can also run the accessibility checker on your documents, and you can click on Start Checking. You want to make sure and check on Attach a Report. So again, this is another way that it can protect you against lawsuits. If you show that you've run the accessibility checker and there's a report there and it shows that everything is clear. Again, I'm going to go through this a little bit more detail next month, but there are ways to check for accessibility in your PDF. Again, if you start with a good, clean Word document, it's so much less trouble. So again, try, if you have the full Adobe, pull up a PDF and run it through the accessibility checker. Multimedia captioning, it's a problem everywhere, right? So there's some things you can do. You can prioritize the captioning of newly created resources and make sure that the captioning is consistent with long-term use. There's some captioning tools in Camtasia, YouTube. You can ask student workers, volunteers. There's also apps that will actually record it for you. It's come such a long way. So some tools, apps, and resources. And if you need to go, I understand. And again, let me go ahead and post, I think some of you have to leave, so let me post the PDF for you just real quick. And then I'll just talk through some of the resources very quickly, maybe 5-10 minutes. But if you have to go, I understand. I completely understand. Okay, so there's a link to the PDF that you can download. So I just want to talk really quickly because we're providing accessible content, but I also want to focus just a little bit about how can you answer questions on disabilities. And again, this could be a whole other presentation, but I just want to walk you through a couple of things. And then, Marcia, I'm sorry, if you're still here, I'll come back to your question. I didn't mean to ignore you. Just get through this very quickly. So in terms of accessible technology, it used to be back in the day we had the big magnifier screen reader and you put the book under it. Well, now you've got those things on your phone. We have all kinds of assistive technology. We have kind of no-tech, which is like, note cards and different things like that, low-tech and high-tech. And we're in the world of high-tech now. And so some of the examples about the beginnings of libraries, we had Braille books and recorded books. I still have a machine from the National Library Service that I use. We have large print books, the CCTV, which is the magnifier over here, and again, the touch type telephone. And then computers got on board. One of the ways you can also help your patrons and also protect yourself is that there's an ease of access center in Microsoft, and it's got a magnifier, a narrator, an on-screen keyboard, and you can set up high contrast. There's also some information here about Microsoft and accessibility. Then Apple also got on board the Mac, so they've got things for vision, hearing, physical and motor skills, learning and literacy. And then came the smartphone and the tablet, right? And there's no end to the different things about apps for people with disabilities. And so Apple has, again, a built-in screen reader, voiceover, zoom and color contrast settings. You can make your font larger. You can also use ebook readers. And so there's no more of this large, huge machine that you have to have. Also, Android has spoken feedback, select to speak, switch access, voice commands, and a braille display. So let me just answer Marcia's question real quick in case she has to leave. Sorry. So you had a patron a couple weeks ago who was trying to download audiobooks on Overdrive, but she was visually impaired and couldn't see the format well on her tablet. Thoughts? Did she have a screen reader to go with her audiobook, or because that could be helpful? Because if she has a tablet, there should be a voiceover or a, if it's an Android, there should be a way to kind of have it read the screen to you and the options that are on the screen. Does that make sense, Marcia? If not, I can keep talking to you about it. So one of the things that might be helpful to you guys, and I did a whole session on this for Swiftland before, I'm just going to kind of go through these. You can come back to them. But it's kind of to see what it's like to have a disability. You can't really understand unless you have one. But there's some simulators out there that kind of simulate what it's like. And it kind of can help you understand a little bit about what people are going through, some of the problems they experience. And so my favorite one here is the mag light. So it's a light and it magnifies. A lot of these are free. Some of them cost a little bit of money. Some of them are no longer available. You know how that happens with apps. So there's some things here for vision. There's some things here for hearing, for color blindness, for braille, for learning, for hearing, for people who can't talk, say they have autism and can't, relate things. There's some images things. So there's some things here like Talk It for people with cerebral palsy who have trouble speaking, and it tries to interpret, and that's not yet available. But there's a whole bunch of things out there that will help people. The app world is fabulous, and a lot of it's free. Learning how to sign, learning how to have flashcards on your phone so you can talk to people. Thinks about learning how to write and trace letters and learn how to read faster. There's also Bard. I encourage you to look into that for your patrons. You can actually sign for them on their application as a librarian, and they can get service. It's an app kind of like Kindle for downloading books and Braille and different things like that. Of course, Overdrive and Netflix and Kindle have accessibility. Netflix will actually have audio descriptions on some of their movies. I don't know if you knew that. Okay, so homework. Try out a disability app and see what it's like. Here's a few that you can try. There's more on that list. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of collections of apps. There's a million things you can look at. These are just some that I wanted to highlight for you. And then, how do you answer questions about disabilities? And I'm going to fly through this. You'll have the toolkit. But I want to strongly promote the Florida Electronic Library. They have a ton of information on health, disabilities. Again, these are some of the specific things like what you would think of: health and medicine, nursing, psychology, health and wellness. These are all ways that your caregivers and your patrons can get information. Here's a few more of them. Also, they have a bunch of ebooks. Again, these are accessible. You can read them. You can have your phone or your tablet speak to you, or your computer. So these are some of the books that are kind of health disability related. There's not a one catch-all for finding disability information. Some of the ones the Florida Library doesn't have, but your library or academic library might have that would be helpful, are things about like Academic Search Premier, some of the education databases. Also, some of the health resources. I starred kind of what are my favorites. Again, Florida Electronic Library gives you a lot of similar information because you are a resident of Florida and your patrons are a resident of Florida. Psych info, again, disabilities are such a wide-ranging area that, again, it may be psychological, it may be, a medical issue, it just depends. There's some general websites I wanted to mention to you. Disability.gov, the ADA homepage. Again, the National Library Service for the blind and physically, I always want to say blind and physically handicapped, but it's always, lately it's been and print disabled. They must have changed their name a while back. Again, you can help your patrons get access to that. So Marcia, your patron who's struggling so much with the audiobooks, she's probably entitled to get that service with Bard and actually download books. And I definitely know that Bard is accessible, so that may be another option for her as well. Okay, and so I've got some screenshots of these things, just kind of real quickly. I'm going to flash through them. Again, you can come back and look at this. And then there's some general websites. When you think about a disability, you're thinking about medical. So a lot of the websites that you think about for that, there's some here. I just, again, come back and look at this. Medline, Medline Plus, National Library of Medicine, the Agency for Healthcare Quality and Research. There's also some general websites for kids' health. Again, disability, it's got parents, teens, children. It's a great site, different languages. Somebody with a disability might be looking for a clinical trial. So again, this is kind of what that looks like. Again, some more general websites. Of course, who hasn't kind of been stalking the CDC right now, right? So there's the CDC, the Mayo Clinic. So just kind of give you a quick look at those. The Kaiser Family Foundation, Mayo Clinic. Sometimes people need help understanding lab tests. And again, these are outside of things you might have in your library. These are free things. And so I just wanted to promote those in addition to things like the physician's desk reference that has your drugs and medicine in it, right? So there's things like the RX list and lab tests online. And then also things for education, because sometimes it's a disability issue, but it's also related to education, right? So again, it's just kind of such a wide-ranging area. So some lab tests, the RX list. Again, some of these are ad heavy, but the information seems to be really decent, and it's free. Also, there's free books out there, free medical books. There's PubMed, has a bookshelf. The Merck manual consumer version is out there for free. The Directory of Open Access Books on Medicine. Of course, the University of Pennsylvania online books page. So again, here's just kind of a quick, really, really quick tour of that. And then there's also some more free books. Of course, Google Books, the Hathy Trust, the Internet Archive. For Google Advanced Search on books, you want to make sure that you click on Full View Only or you won't get the full book. Hathy Trust, again, I just kind of did a search for breast cancer. Internet Archive Disabilities, you can see that there's some full text books here. Again, free articles. So this is a website that has free medical journals, the Public Library of Science, again, the PubMed Central, the Directory of Open Access Journals. Again, we're doing our whirlwind tour here, but again, you'll have the PDF. I'll post it again at the end, and you can come back and look at these. But my focus here really quickly was just to kind of help you. How do you get books and articles to people? How do you help them answer their questions? Again, Biomed Central, Google Scholar, OISTER. These are all free sites where you can get books and articles. Google Scholar, you can actually set to a bunch of your libraries. So for instance, I selected Florida Hillsborough here. If you don't know how to do this, just send me an email, I'll walk you through it. And so you can actually have it kind of do an interface to your library's databases and things that might be like a good medical library. Even if you don't have access, you can still look at and get good resources to kind of follow up with, maybe interlibrary loan, that kind of thing. Again, here's kind of an example for Google Scholar. OISTER, which is through OCLC. There's free education articles because, as we said, sometimes it's an education issue. So this is ERIC, the free version. Again, I believe the Florida library has ERIC, the full version. I may have that wrong, but so you may want to check this one out. Again, for ERIC, you want to make sure you click on full text available on ERIC, or you're going to have to do interlibrary loan. So that's just something to keep in mind. So statistics. Again, if you're trying to make your case, and you want to, hopefully you don't have to do that, but sometimes in libraries, administration, colleges, you really need to hit home with why it's so important. And statistics are kind of one of the best ways. Also, these statistics will help you in terms of who is your patron, building that patron profile, and also thinking about your collection. If you're going to have a collection on disability resources, well, what's the disability in your area? What's the highest things you need to focus on? We saw the statistics for Florida, but you can also get down to your county level as well, and I'll kind of point that one out as we go through. So again, here's some access to disability statistics. Again, you see this one here has county reports. This is through Cornell University, and this is where I got the statistics from my PowerPoint. So you can do United States, you can do Florida, so you can kind of look at that. Also the census has a bazillion statistics. I had the best luck going to this website for the census and not just going to straight to the census site. It's an advanced search that's just a little bit easier to use. So again, county health rankings and roadmaps. So Sharon, that might be something you want to look at. Also the National Center for Health Statistics. So again, this is something I did. I looked up Lee County, Florida, and if you click on it, you can kind of get some statistics. Again, look at a bunch of different ones because they all do things a little bit differently. But you can see here that some of the things about premature death, health factors, smoking. Again, so it gives you some health information, which is also important to your patron profile and maybe building things for your collection. So this is the National Center for Health Statistics. Again, there's some free health and disability statistics, the statehealthfacts.org, Fast Stats. There's also one just for Florida, the Florida Health Charts. And then there's the National Center for Education Statistics, should you need that. So this is kind of statehealthfacts.org, and you can get all kinds of different health facts. This is one for, I believe I did this for Florida, so you can get some statistics there. And then the Florida Health Chart, so you can look at, health equity, life expectancy. There's a community map. There's a risk factors map, social and economic factors. So this is just for Florida. I'm sure you guys have seen this one, right? Again, the National Center for Education Statistics. You can get some information there. And then a lot of times people are trying to find a doctor or somebody to contact in their state about ADA or different things like that. So there's a couple of directory finders I wanted to mention to you. Medline Plus has doctor lists, dentist lists, hospitals and clinics. And these, again, it also helps you find libraries, which is great. The Department of Labor directory, so these are the state liaisons for the state. So for instance, it's alphabetical, so you see first up is Alabama. So if you needed to contact somebody for any reason. This is Doctor Finder. Again, this is a free site, but again, it's got can help you locate a doctor for free. Again, there's some people with disabilities have a rare disorder. Sometimes you need an education resource. So these are just a couple more. So this is NORD for people that have rare disorders. And then this is Department of Education, Organizations and Resource Directory. So homework activity 9 is to visit a couple of sites in each category, learn about them, maybe a general website, look at free books, articles, statistics, directories. And so what can we do about this? And so some of the things that we can do to collaborate for change, sorry it's cut off up there at the top, is create pressure as a profession. Again, pushing back against publishers and content providers when you're negotiating those licenses, looking at your VPAT, looking at 508 and WCAG 2 to make sure you're covered, just from the get-go that you're covered with the resources that you provide. And then again, making the case for accessibility, creating that conscientious culture where everybody has accessible resources. And this just makes sure that we have better service for everyone. So homework checklist. This is the whole list. If you would like to do it, please go forth. Maybe it's something you do with your staff. Maybe there's just one thing here you find helpful. You know everything I've talked about today, and that's excellent. Hopefully I've added something to what you've looked at today, maybe a new source or an app or something like that. That's all I have. I'm sorry, 15 minutes over. But do you have any questions? Hopefully I answered your questions and I didn't miss something in the chat. If so, please let me know. Again, it's a lot of information. I'll post the link here again in case you want the PDF. And I know that this has been recorded. So if you missed something or you had to leave, please let me know. Again, if you have a specific question that you just didn't want to type in chat or whatever, please just contact me directly. This is something I'm passionate about, and it just increases my knowledge to help other people if you have a question. Thank you guys so much. It was a whirlwind, and again, you can come back and look at the slides. They're in the PDF. Oh, good. I'm so glad that you had some other people come in. That's amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you. I hope it's something useful to you and your patrons, and that go forth and spread the word to people. Use my presentation to share with people, or apps that you like or whatever. Again, I hope you'll get together as a staff and do some of this homework. I know that's not really something that's a favorite thing, but thank you guys again for attending and giving me that extra 15 minutes. And yes, thank you, Deb. Deb actually meets AAA standards for the WCAG 2.0, so that's awesome. Swiftland does that. Not everybody has a sign language interpreter, and so I'm so glad she could be here for, I think I have her for almost everyone that I do. So she's gotten used to my fast talking. So thank you so much, Deb. So thank you guys very much. If there's no questions, I'm gonna be quiet now and let Taylor talk. And I do hope that you'll come next month. I'm gonna walk through a lot of content and accessibility in your documents, in your websites, in your social media. So hopefully that'll be something that would also help you.
Thank you, Stephanie, for an informative webinar. As always, we encourage you to keep an eye on the Swiftland CE calendar, the Swiftland Facebook page, or your message from the listserv. Thank you everyone for attending and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Deb.